Hi, it's me, Wilhelmina, of course. Who else? Um, I'm going to read you a story of my mum's now. My mum was a storyteller. She was not a story writer, but she remembered all the events of her life because as soon as they occurred, shortly after they occurred, she would tell a story about them. And she would put every detail of that story in. And in her telling the story, she memorized this and she fixed it in her mind. And she could tell that same story over and over, years, decades later, and it would come out almost word for word each time. So we grew up with her telling us stories. Now, they didn't always come out just straight from the beginning to the end. It might take a whole evening to get through a story because she'd get off on one track and get off on another track and then come down. But we always loved them. I grew up on her stories. I thrived on them. This is one time that it seems like I must have had a tape recorder going because it sounds just like her talking as I read it. I can just about hear her words. So I'm going to just go in and start reading it. It's got the story of Tobackabout in it, when she grew up on a farm in the south shore of Nova Scotia, Canada. She was a country girl. Okay, so it starts off here. It says, I'm asking Mum a few questions. Me. There I go. Me, Mum. I was transcribing it. Me. These are some things you were going to tell me about, Mum. First of all, Shirley's grandmother mending your sweater, and then Tobackabout, and I mentioned a couple of other things. Mum says, well, Shirley's grandmother. Me. Shirley Richardson? She was your friend, and you got the turkeys from her older sister Margaret? Mum, yes, when Margaret was moving away. Shirley was my age, 6 months older, and we have contact now. She and her husband live in Florida, and they've been here to visit us. Me. You mean Shirley and Walter? Mum, yes. Walter was an American from Massachusetts, but back in my school days, when we were going to school together, I'd go down to visit her. And of course, I had to more or less get permission. Shirley had to quit school when she was 14. She was a big girl, and she had to cook for the boarders they had, and so on. The Gunners, and so on. And the school teacher. Because Mrs. Esther, Shirley's mother, as a widow, went out to do a bit of home nursing when she had the chance. Anyway, so that's why Shirley never got the rest of her education, and yet she's been around all over the place and working for people. Then we've got an interruption here. The phone rings. We begin another time. Just get a little tangent there about Shirley and Walter. Me, we were down to Mrs. Esther's. Mum, do you remember where that was? Me. Yes, way back off the road, on the side of the hill there, against the forest. The house was huge. Mum, oh, a lovely big house, and big trees. Well, there was 5 trees altogether when I was growing up. Chestnut trees. And then, in the springtime, that hillside, the first part of the hillside, was just yellow with daffodils. Oh, yes. They grew before the haying was done. The haying kept the shrubs and bushes down, and the next spring the daffodils would grow again. And then there was a little creek ran down under the hill, and the barn was across the creek. And then you came down to the road. The creek was not exactly under the barn, just in front of it, and they had a little bridge. So Mrs. Esther's house, in the olden days, when they cut the firewood and when they did the mowing of the hay, every place that was cleared had to have hay made, because everybody had a barn full of cattle to feed in the winter. So anyway, you could see way over to Annie MacDonald's on that hill. Annie MacDonald had that beautiful big home there. Her husband was Albert. He was a mason. He did mason work, stonework, in the States, and made good money. So they lived on that hill. And before that, Stewarts lived there, and before them it was the Hardings. And yet now the new developers have taken that whole area and put roads through and surveyed it out for homes, and they call it Richardson Head, and there never was a Richardson lived on there. So anyway, down to Mrs. Esther's. Before you went down to Jones's Harbour. Oh, what a wonderful place that was. So anyway, this one time after school, I went over with Shirley to play a while and then come home. And I think that how it was that my brothers were going to the harbour. because I'd never be allowed to come home from Mrs. Esther's alone at that time. I was a little kid. And oh, what a lovely place to play. We went out back where the blackberries grew, and all the briars were, and where there was a great big stone wall. It was like the French stone walls. You could walk on the top of it. It was flat. Our stone walls were just rocks thrown up. The French stone walls were all down around the shores before the English ever came. They built these big stone walls. You could wheel a big wheelbarrow on top of them. So anyway, these briars were grown up there at the edge of the orchard, and somebody had made these little roads in through the briars, so you could run in and around and through these briar things, and it was just great. Except that I had a beautiful gray wool sweater on, with a little pattern in it, you know. So here I was, running in there and getting it all full of things off of the blackberries. And then, me, blackberries? You had blackberries there? Mum, yes. Now let me think. Shirley was the youngest in the family, so it must have been the older children who made the runways. Well, we got in the house again, and here was my sweater, full of pulls, you know. So here was Grandma Richardson, sitting in her rocking chair. And it was a rocking chair without arms on it. She sat sort of like the pantry was behind her, but she sat in front of the window. There was 2 windows there, and she could sit and she could look out over the fields and over to Annie MacDonald's. That was her place to sit. And that was good, too, because there was the kitchen stove between the pantry and the porch doors, so it was a warm spot, and yet she could see what was going on down the road and who was going to the harbor and so on. The dear old soul. She went to work mending my sweater before I went home. And that's what I remember about Shirley's grandmother. This next section is called Tobackabout. Well, another place Shirley and I used to like to go when we got older was swimming in the harbor. We were never allowed to go down around the wharves. It was too dangerous. But we used to go to Tobackabout. We'd go from Shirley's house, down and across the road, and there was another big field there, a hay field, and we'd cross that, and when we got to the water by the shore, there was a big rock out a ways, and the tide used to come in and go way up the harbor and then go out. Well, this rock had made... There was a hole washed out there, deep enough, so you had to paddle to get across, but it wasn't very wide, and that was the greatest place. It was always warm. Why they called it Tobackabout was, in the olden days, they had the sailing ships come into the harbor, Jones's Harbor, and in order to turn around and go out again, the harbor entrance wasn't that big, you know, so they had to back up. How was it? Well, they had to go up there and then back around. It was wide enough there to back about. Tobackabout. It was called Tobackabout. Tobackabout was the place where they came to back about and get headed out. And then across from the wharves, the harbor was deep, but it wasn't very wide. The channel wasn't. And across from the wharves was Esther's Neck. Why they called it Esther's Neck was because it was a neck of land that ran out here and there, and it belonged to Mrs. Esther. And it was big enough that the men used to have their fishing shanties on it. Father was one. He had one when I was little, and Claude Pierce had one. They'd keep their lobster traps out there. It was nice and big and high and right by the water. A great place. Well, over the years, with the seas pounding against it and so on, now there's very little of it left, of the neck, especially on the outside, where it was against the Atlantic swells. And so anyway, I used to have to come down with the boys after I got old enough to bring supplies, food, to Father when he was fishing through the week, or lobstering. That's mostly what he did. He stayed down all week and came home on the weekends. Me. How far was it, Mum, from home to the harbor? A couple of miles? Mum, no, we always said a mile down, because it'd be a mile, but it would be a mile and a half, because it was a good ways from Mrs. Esther's down. But we used to go down there to the harbour with the food, and we'd just holler, and someone would hear us, and they'd come over in the skiff and get the supplies. And most of the time they took us over there too, so we could run around for a while. Oh, and it was just lonely after that, after the barns were gone and Father didn't go fishing. You know, when the boys grew up and they went to the States to work, my brothers. We'd go down there and lay on the wharf right flat and look down. We could see right to the bottom of the water, and we could see the sculpins or whatever was down there moving. The water was deep, but if the sun was shining, we could see right to the bottom, green. And then there was a time when Father lived at the harbour and had his... You see, he went away to work in the summers, but he came home in the winters. And he always had a boat and went lobstering to teach the boys in case they couldn't get to the States to work when they grew up. This happened, too, in the 30s. They weren't allowed over to work because they couldn't take the jobs from the Americans, of course. So anyway, F.T. Nickerson, F.T. was what we always called him. F.T. used to come down and buy lobsters, and so he had a shack built down there on this side. He didn't have to go across the channel to Esther's Neck. Further up there were several cabins, but his was a house, more the style of a house than a cabin. It had a loft upstairs. Of course you had to climb up a ladder that was nailed to the side of the wall, but F.T.'s shack was warm and nice. To get their water to drink, they used to go along a little farther to a place called Ryder's Brook. In the brook, up a ways, a spring used to come up. There was always a place there you could dip your bucket in and bring back your water. They didn't have to have wells or anything. One year, when I suppose I might have been 10 or 11, F.T.'s brother, Percy Nickerson, came down, and he was buying. So he bought his family down for the winter. Mrs. F.T. and 3 children at least. There was, Gloria was one of them. That's where I love the name Gloria. She was more my age. And then there was an older one. And then there was a young boy. They used to come to school with us all through the winter. So I'd go down there. And the floor didn't have any linoleum on it, but it was a nice floor. Mrs. Nickerson used to scrub it with sand. You know, sand and a brush. And she kept that as white and lovely and clean as anything. Me, would she have water and sand mixed? Mum, just the dry sand and the brush. And the house was big enough so the children could climb up the ladder and have their bedrooms upstairs. Later, when the Nickersons weren't coming down anymore, they sold the place to Father. It's still there. Someone else has it now and has made it into a house. Mrs. Esther's house is gone. It was a lovely big house, and the dining room furniture was just beautiful. I remember that. The big table had the lovely legs on it, you know. That table was brought home from the West Indies, and they found out after years that it had termites in it. They had to do away with it. This would be after Mr. Sid died, and the old grandmother and the grandfather were gone. Me. Would Mr. Sid be Shirley's grandfather? Mum, no, her father. Her parents were Esther and Sidney Richardson, and the old grandfather was John Richardson. I forget the grandmother's name. But after Shirley's grandparents died, they still had old people living there, because they had Aunt Nan, who was Sid's sister. She had worked all her life in a department store in Shelburne, so that used to help Mrs. Esther out after her husband died, with clothing especially. She had another sister, I forget her name, who would always be sending their old clothes out to the growing up kids, you see. They dressed well. And it was from Aunt Nan. So when she retired, she came to Mrs. Esther's to live. There was plenty of room downstairs, bedrooms and sitting rooms. It was a wonderful old house. And they always boarded the teacher. And in the fall, they cooked for the Capies. That's what we always called them, the gunners. Lots of the gunners stayed in shacks at the harbour. There was quite a few of them, but a couple would board at Mrs. Esther's. Whoever got down there first would do that. So there was a lot of baking and cooking. They cooked for the ones that was down to the harbour, too. The gunners would come up to Mrs. Esther's and get their cooked food. Anyway, Mrs. Esther went to look after someone as a nurse, and after that somebody else wanted her to come here and come there, so this was what she was doing. Shirley had started school in the fall, and then the gunning season started, and the gunners came down. Shirley got in touch with her mother somehow and sent her a message that she'd have to come home because these people had come. Mrs. Esther sent a message back, "Oh, you can cook. You look after them. You'll be all right." There she was, 14 years old, and she had to quit school. So that became her profession. She worked for a while down there, where they were training ministers in Halifax, and she worked in Lockport. She worked for businessmen, and she worked for families, doctors, and so on like that. She was really in demand. They knew how capable she was. She could look after the family, too. The kids could go to school, and they come home and they minded her, just like she was one of their parents. So she did well, and she loved it, being with people. She was accepted right into the family. That was Shirley. Next section is called Out in the Rowboat. I think I've told you the story about going out in the rowboat on Sunday night. One Sunday afternoon, Mum decided she and I would take a walk and go down to Mrs. Esther's. I guess maybe Father was away and the boys were okay home and so on. So we went down, and we had supper. And then you always sat around a while before you started home. It was in the summertime and the evenings were long. Shirley and I, we got kind of bored. So we got out of the house after supper and made our way down to the harbour. We didn't have to go down the road. There was always a shortcut through the woods to the wharves. And we got there and went tracking around down there and nobody around. So there was this dory pulled up on the skids. We looked around for the oars, I guess, and got them, found some, and we got in and thought we'd just row out a bit in the harbour. And begosh, we were rowing, and we had on our patent leather shoes and our Sunday dresses, and we looked and the water was starting to come in the boat, so we thought we'd better get back. And we had to take off our shoes and put them up here and pull our dresses up so they wouldn't get wet. We were rowing, one on each oar, and it was getting dark, and we couldn't get back to the wharf. We didn't realize, but the tide was starting to go out, and it was taking us out. Well, we began talking to each other about this, you know. Pull this way and pull that way and so on. And it happened that there was a family living there, Claude Pierce and his wife. They had just got ready for bed. The 2 kids were in bed. And they heard these voices out there. So Claude came out to see what was going on, and then he realized. Then he had to get a boat and come out and take us in. That boat we took out was up on the skids because it was leaking and was waiting to be repaired. You might have made it across to the neck in it, but not the way we was rowing. So anyway, there we were, but we were soaked. Our dress tails were wet and so on. Anyway, he took us back, and Lottie made us a fire. We got out of our dresses, and they gave us blankets to put around us. We thought Claude must have gone back to bed, and I never realized until years afterwards that he had gone up to tell Mum and Mrs. Esther where we were. Anyway, when we got dried up enough, it was dark, and we made our way back to the house. We never said a word. And here, they never said a word to us. We just said, well, we was down to the harbour, and we was into Lottie's. We never knew that Claude had been up there and told me. You didn't tell him you were almost swept out to sea, Mum. That's why they weren't worried, you see, while we were in the shack getting dried out. Anyway, Mum did say something, and I just said, well, no, because my shoes were dry by then and my dress. We weren't supposed to take the boat, let alone go out by ourselves. Shirley and I laughed about that when she was visiting me. So Mum and I went home in the dark. It was wonderful walking through the woods. No houses, nothing to harm you. We never saw a bear in those days. Later on, when the farms closed in, you know, and people started moving away, the bears started coming, because things were growing up. All the hay fields were grown up. That's the way my mum told me stories. all stories of her growing up on the farm. Loved them all. Okay, say goodbye to you. Hope you liked it too. See you later.